Welcome to Fantasy Football Today for CBS Local Sports. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Dave Richard. We have the starts and sits that you need: a quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end to help you dominate your fantasy leagues for week number 9. Let's get started with the start of the week. Love the setup for Chase Edmonds as we look at the start running backs for me going into this week's matchups. And Edmonds is in a great spot, taking over for Kenyan Drake. He's out with an ankle injury. Dolphins' run defense has been good, but I think the workload for Edmonds is what you want to buy into here. Excellent setup for him if he gets the 18-plus touches that Drake has gotten 5 of the 7 games so far this season. Edmonds hasn't needed much work to be successful. This could be a blow-up game for him. Love the setup for him as a potential top 5 running back in week number 9. I'm starting Edmonds along with J.K. Dobbins and J.D. McKissick. Let's go with the initials. Both those guys are in good spots. McKissick better in PPR than non-PPR, and Dobbins in a good situation because there is no Mark Ingram for this week's matchup against the Colts. Dave sit running backs for week 9. Melvin Gordon, Jonathan Taylor, and Ronald Jones. So Dave, in that same game for Dobbins going against the Colts, you're sitting Taylor going against the Ravens.
He just has not looked good. And when Jordan Wilkins looks better than you, there's something wrong. And I think the Colts have recognized this. They're probably going to split the workload that we thought would theoretically be all Jonathan Taylor's by now. Until we see that rectified, I can't trust Taylor in my lineup. And by the way, they're taking on the Ravens. That's a pretty good run defense.
Yep, just a bad setup, and if you have an open roster spot, not a bad idea to pick up Jordan Wilkins now, just in case he's starting to take over in this Colts backfield. From the running backs, we go to the quarterbacks. Dave's 3 quarterbacks to start this week: Ryan Tannenhill, Ben Roethlisberger, Derek Carr. So Dave, tell me about Tannenhill and why you like him.
I know he's playing at Chicago, and that scared off a lot of fantasy managers before, including last week with Drew Brees, but Brees ended up having a pretty good game. And I think at this point, we just have to trust Ryan Tannehill. He's had this immaculate record as far as getting you 21 or more fantasy points. I believe it's 14 rather, of his last 17 games. He's gotten that job done. I think you trust him, you keep him in your lineups. His receiving core is healthy. He should be able to get the job done against Chicago.
All right, we're going to differ on Ryan Tannenhill. It's actually 14 of 17 with 20 or more fantasy points. Last 2 weeks, he's been 20 and 21 points. Coincides with Taylor Lewan not being there, and I think the protection could be an issue for him once again. I don't love the matchup for him going against the Bears. As we've seen, yes, the Bears did give up 23 fantasy points to Drew Brees last week. Only quarterback over 20 fantasy points. Now, the last 2 quarterbacks against the Bears have gotten multiple touchdowns, with Jared Goff doing it 2 weeks prior. But I think it's going to be a rough game for Ryan Tannehill to reach his ceiling. 21 points is, I think, about where he's going to finish. And as we've seen more times than not, that does not make you a top 12 quarterback. So he's outside the top 12 for me. I would try to sit Ryan Tannehill this week. From the quarterbacks, go the wide receivers, and I'm expecting this to be the week for Marquise Brown. You love when we get the squeaky wheel scenario, and this is exactly what we're dealing with looking at this matchup against the Colts. They've struggled against opposing wide receivers of late. Brown comes off that game last week against Steelers, did score a touchdown, but only 2 targets. He wants the ball. This is a matchup where Lamar Jackson will feed him the ball. Get Marquise Brown back in your lineups. Blow-up game is coming on that turf in Indianapolis. Speed kills. He will have a big performance. Count on it this week against the Colts. Sit wide receivers for Dave: Amari Cooper, Devontae Parker, and DJ Chark. So, Dave, we got Devontae Parker scored a touchdown last week, but minimal production. Tough matchup against the Cardinals. You're saying stay away.
How about all 3 of these all 3 of these receivers have relatively new quarterbacks throwing to them, at least in the case of Devontae Parker. He's had a little bit of experience. And yeah, the matchup against Arizona isn't particularly good. I don't think we learned anything about Tagovailoa last week, except that he was 12 of 22 passing, not jumping off the page like Justin Herbert and Joe Burrow did in their initial starts into the NFL. If you can pass on Devontae Parker, you definitely should.
Yep, and get ready for a lot of Patrick Peterson on Devontae Parker as well. Start tight ends for you, Dave. You got Jared Cook, Eric Ebron, and Evan Ingram. Ingram's the interesting one because yet to score a touchdown through the air on the year, but you're sticking with him in this matchup against Washington.
You know, the Giants could have gotten away from him after he basically cost them a game 2 weeks ago, and they didn't. In fact, they gave him more targets, and he did better with those targets. There's still some of the throws that Daniel Jones makes that are mind-bogglingly bad that go Ingram's way, but I think he can make do with the remaining ones that do go his way. And I don't think the matchup is that terrible against Washington, particularly since Landon Collins, the guy that usually covers tight ends, out for the year with a torn Achilles. That means that Ingram will see a backup in coverage more often than not.
Hopefully this is the week he gets into the end zone through the air. Does have a rushing touchdown on the season. As Dave referenced, the targets have been there. 19 targets in his last 2 games. So hopefully the production starts to follow. Only 11 catches with those 19 targets. The sit tight ends for me: Hayden Hurst, Mike Gesicki, Dalton Schultz. May seem like a surprise to say sit Hayden Hurst. He's been consistent of late, picked up some of the opportunities with the Falcons dealing with injuries at the receiving core. But take a look at what the Broncos have done against opposing tight ends. They haven't given up a touchdown since week 1. That includes matchups against Rob Gronkowski, Travis Kelce, and Hunter Henry. The last 2 weeks against Kelce and Henry have been really fantastic. For whatever it's worth, the Broncos are doing a good job in containing opposing tight ends. Could be a little bit of a struggle for Hayden Hurst this week. All right, there's your starts and sits at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end for week number 9. Check out our Fantasy Football Today in 5 podcasts, as well as our full-length podcast, wherever podcasts are available. And, of course, check us out on CBS Sports HQ. For Dave Richard, I'm Jamie Eisenberg. This has been Fantasy Football Today for CBS Local Sports.